Let's talk about how we apply these probabilistic models and recurrence intervals to structural design. Let's go back to our basic notion of risk categories. We've got four of them. The sort of agricultural type facility or storage facility where there's little to no human occupancies down here in risk category 1. Your critical and actually essential lifeline facilities, lifeline being the key, are out here at number 4. That's special hospitals, special surgery centers, places that are needed for post-disaster recovery, immediate post-disaster recovery, are sitting here in category 4. Category 3 are important facilities where either the large number of occupancy elevates the level of risk to society, or as in the case of, say, K through 12 type schools, the societal trauma of what might happen after a lot of fatalities is something that society just they don't want. So they're willing to devote more resources to designing at a higher level. And that puts everything else into category 2. So your typical office building, your commercial building, your retail buildings, those will typically be there in category 2. This is not categories that are associated with houses because residential construction is covered under a different building code. Right now, the diagram I'm about to show you is one that's got lots of numbers. I'm only going to show you the selected ones. The idea here is that we're going to look at 3 different types of failures. Right? We've got the sort of least bad type of failure. That's more of your yield type failure, where things are not sudden. You have a warning of impending doom, and you don't have this widespread or progressive damage effect. Unlike down here at the other extreme, where it's very sudden, no warning of impending doom, a fracture or a buckling type of thing, and the consequence of that is something that then spreads widely to the rest of the system. So we have potentially much greater likelihood of having really bad stuff happen from a human safety standpoint. And this other third category is sitting there in the middle. So when we look at, say, a silo type of situation on a farm, right, the potential for disaster there in terms of human life, not business life, but human life, is smaller. So we have a target failure probability or annualized failure probability of about 1.25 times 10 to the minus 4th. If you take the reciprocal of that, you'll get to about 8,000, and like so, right? So that's a 1 in 8,000 chance in a given year that barn, that storage facility, would have some sort of a failure of a general gentle kind of a nature, where there's advance warning. You can make sure the occupants of that facility are out, right? So compared to the others, it's an elevated likelihood of failure, but compared to big picture, 1 out of 8,000 in a year is not particularly very large. In your more typical sort of office building kind of thing, and maybe this intermediate level of a failure type, where it could be sudden or some sort of progressive, we're going to be further away from the edge of the cliff of disaster. And so now we're at 5 times 10 to the minus 6th for the target failure. And that's a 1 in 200,000 chance, right? So office buildings, of course, have a lot more people in there. The threat to human life is much larger. And so we want to stay further away from the edge of the cliff. Now, there are numbers in these blank spots too. I'm just illustrating a couple of these. Then you go to say, a school building and a failure mode of some sort of buckling or fracture kind of thing. And now we're looking at 2.5 times 10 to the minus 7th. And when we take the reciprocal of that, that's a 1 in 4 million chance in any one given year. And so that just illustrates the range of the target reliabilities that we're after, or you can also call it the target annual failure likelihoods. We don't want to guarantee failure, and there's no such thing as that, but we are trying to protect against it and try to quantify what we're targeting here. Right? These are all out of ASCE 7-16, table 1.3-1. Now let's talk just a little bit about what failure means here. And from a big picture standpoint, it's capacity is less than demand. Now, it's not always about strength. It can be about stiffness or other limit states, but you can think about whenever we have some sort of capacity that's less than what the demand is, that's a problem. We can characterize that in terms of what we call the safety margin, right? Capacity minus demand. And if that number is greater than zero, well, that's good. We have more capacity than demand. If it's less than, then that's not so good. That's the bad state. We can also do a safety factor, taking capacity and dividing by demand, right? And you saw that in your mechanics and materials classes that we talked about that. There, you'd say theoretically the threshold between good and bad is exactly one, or unity. From a practical design standpoint, usually you have limit states where that factor of safety that's minimum that you want is 1.67, meaning we want to have 2/3 of an additional capacity than what we really need, we think we need, that is, and in order to sort of stay away from the edge of the cliff. That's really an uncertainty and variability thing that we're accounting for. You can also flip that and talk about the utilization. How much of the capacity are we using up with this demand? So that's the demand divided by capacity. You won't find very many of the US-based design codes that look at utilization. They're usually looking at some form of a safety factor. The problem with all of this, by the way, is that depending on how we form these ratios, the probabilistic then development of this is potentially more challenging, and it doesn't always give us the same answer. So what we really do is take natural logs of these kinds of things to do some of our work, and we work on the log space. The key in design here is how do we select the members that we have enough capacity to meet the target when both loads and capacities are uncertain and variable, right? Loads of essentially load effects, or the demands and capacities, are uncertain and variable. They're variable because we don't know, well, there's a natural variation called aleatory variation. And then the uncertain part is that we don't always know the right way to model these things. The world does not have to behave according to our models. Even if we call them laws, it doesn't have to behave that way. That's called epistemic uncertainty, that we just don't have the right model for these things. Sometimes we have the right model, but we're uncertain about what the parameters of the model might be. And so that's the key in design, is how do we figure out when both of these things, the demand and capacity, are variable, how do we figure out how to adjust the capacity when we're doing the design so that we attempt to achieve these target likelihoods of success. And what do we do when demand is associated with capacity and capacity is associated with demand, as happens in the seismic world, right?